Hi, my name is Eleanor Tatum, and I'm the publisher and editor-in-chief of the New York Amsterdam News. The coronavirus crisis has brought serious distress to local economies and advertising along with them. The New York Amsterdam News has partnered with the Local Media Association during this unprecedented crisis. Help us continue our important work in chronicling the life of Black New Yorkers, and consider making a donation to the COVID-19 Local News Fund today. Go to givebutter.com/Amsterdam News. Again, that is givebutter.com/Amsterdam News. Thank you and stay safe.
It's Thursday, June 11th, and welcome to the New York Amsterdam News Podcast. I'm Cyril Josh Barker. On this week's episode, my guest is New York State Senator Jamaal Bailey. He's going to be speaking with me about the recent passage of a bill repealing Civil Rights Law 50A, making it easier for the public to access police disciplinary records. Well, as protests continue in reaction to the May 25th police killing of Black unarmed George Floyd in Minneapolis, attention is now being turned towards police reforms. State Law 50A is often used to shield police misconduct and disciplinary processes from the public view. The New York State Senate and Assembly recently voted to approve a bill to repeal the law, making misconduct and disciplinary records more difficult to hide by police departments. Police unions say repealing 50A raises major safety concerns for accused police officers, and we welcome you to this episode of our podcast, and we're very happy to have Senator Jamaal Bailey to talk with us today about this very issue on today's episode. Law 50A has been on the books since the 1970s, and legislators have been trying for a long time to get it repealed. Protesters have been talking about this. If you've heard or seen any of the signs in the street about repealing 50A, it's definitely a major issue that is going on right now. 50A actually played a big role in the 2014 police killing case of Eric Garner as the family struggled to get the discipline records for the officer involved in that case. And so we're going to be talking with Senator Bailey about that here shortly. Well, it is Thursday and the paper did come out today, and I have several stories that I do want to go over to you. The first is our front page story titled Defund the Police. It's our lead story about the movement to cut funding from the NYPD. Mayor Bill de Blasio recently pledged to cut funding from the police department and give it to youth and social services, and we dig a little deeper in how that's going. We also have a story about Councilwoman Inez Barron and Assemblyman Charles Barron, who introduced a bill that would create an agency that would have more power than the Civilian Complaint Review Board, that would have a greater effort on policing the city. And lastly, in our arts and entertainment section, we have an interview with actress Kieran Giovanni about her role as Ruby Daniels on the BET drama American Soul. And you can read all those stories and more in the paper. All we ask is that you go get it safely. And you can also read these stories online at amsterdamnews.com. Well, I do have one announcement to make, and that is that the New York Amsterdam News is now on Instagram. We recently launched our brand new Instagram account, and we're so excited about it, and we definitely want you to be a part of that experience with us. You can go to Instagram and follow us at NYAmNews. That's NYAMNEWS. And you can see some great photos and things that we're covering in the paper, and we definitely hope to see you there. Well, my guest this week is State Senator Jamaal Bailey, who represents parts of the Bronx. He's on the phone with me discussing the recent passage of a bill he sponsored that repeals Law 50A, making it easier for the public to access disciplinary records of police officers. Welcome to the podcast, Senator Bailey. How are you?
I'm doing quite well. How are you today?
I'm doing great. I'm feeling good because this bill is so important. Repealing 50A has become such a hot button issue for a lot of people. As I was saying earlier, we've been seeing protests in the streets, people yelling about repealing 50A. I know I've seen signs from protesters holding up signs saying repeal 50A. And, here we are, passed in the Senate and the Assembly. Let's go back a little bit first, because this bill has actually been, this law rather, has been on the books since the 1970s. Is that right?
That's correct. In 1976, Senator Frank Padovan introduced the law, and the original intent of the law was a laudable one. It was to ensure that officers and their families were not subject to harassment, which over the years, through court cases and other legal interpretations, it really served as an impenetrable bar on disciplinary records in the state of New York for police officers, and it was incredibly difficult to overcome. So, at this point, for the sake of transparency and justice, we needed to ensure that we repeal 50A, and here we are today.
Wonderful, wonderful. And tell us how this is exactly impacting people, because I guess one of the latest examples we can use, actually there's two. The first one, of course, revolving, George Floyd's death actually, absolutely brought some much needed attention to 50A, because we found out that the officer, Derek Chauvin, actually had about 15 or maybe 16 different, disciplines or about issues with misconduct. And so had that happened, had we known about that, obviously what happened to Mr. Floyd might not have happened. But this also goes back to 2014 with the passing, or rather with the killing, I should say, of Eric Garner, because the family tried so hard to get the discipline records and the conduct records of the officer that killed him.
So, yes, those records were, from my understanding, released only by virtue of a whistleblower, right? And you shouldn't have to rely on whistleblowers when you have public employees who are charged with serving us in order to obtain those disciplinary records. That shouldn't be a step that we have to go through. I think that when you contrast it, like you said, when you look at Minnesota and the availability in the potential to obtain those records so much sooner than if that case could have happened in the state of New York. We may not even know Officer Chauvin's name, former officer. Let's be very clear, former Officer Chauvin's name. And the misconduct complaints he had against him. So it's a welcome day in the state.
Right. Yeah, it certainly is. I know that you were the sponsor of this bill to repeal 50A in the Senate, and in the Assembly, it was Assemblyman Daniel O'Donnell. What inspired you to take on this fight? Because this is actually something that has been talked about for quite a long time. And I know when we talked earlier this week for the interview for the article, which is on our website at amsterdamnews.com, you were telling me that when you were elected, this was something that you really wanted to change. And so tell me about why you were so passionate about this.
It's all about accountability and transparency and making sure that people are able to trust the members of law enforcement that police their streets. I'll say again, I believe that the vast majority of law enforcement officers are really good people who do a really good job. But much like in any profession, we need to make sure that we know the bad folks who are in any profession so that we can find a way to root them out so that we can establish more trust. And I truly believe, I truly believe this, that, this will go a long way towards establishing a public trust.
And that's something that is a lot of people are talking about right now, is the trust between the community and the police. Why do you think it would give trust? Because what this does exactly, and I have to keep reiterating this, is that for many, many years, the discipline records and conduct records of police officers, the misconduct records of police officers, you had to go through a lot of hurdles to get that. And now with the repeal of 50A, it's a little bit easier. How is this going to help? Because there's a lot of things that can be done to help mend the trust between the police and the community, particularly the Black community. But tell us why repealing 50A can help in that path of restoration of trust.
So if you wanted to obtain the disciplinary records, you would have to meet an unreasonably high burden. Like, as I mentioned to you before, that bar that would essentially bar these records. Now you'd be able to still say it's still the process, right? You still have to send a FOIA request. You still have to ask for those records in an official capacity, but the records would be available unless they are records that pertain to the officer's personal matters or their family matters, which I'm in 100% in agreement with. Just because you are a member of law enforcement, you deserve the right to privacy like anybody else. You shouldn't be harassed or annoyed, and your family's information should not be there, and they shouldn't be subject to harassment or annoyment. And having that public trust and that ability to be able to know that you can obtain these records if you want them will be helpful. But 50A on its own is a great step, but it's much better in concert with the other part of the other suite and package of legislation that we were able to get passed up in Albany. Because you're right, no one piece of legislation will restore the public trust. You have to have legislation, And most importantly, I believe you have to have meaningful and difficult conversation. And as a result of what happened to Mr. George Floyd, I think so many Americans, so many New Yorkers who never had a desire to have that conversation were suddenly forced to have that conversation because it was clear, indisputable video evidence in front of their eyes. And because we're in quarantine, where else you going? You know you're watching it. You know you saw it. You know your kids saw it. Now you got to talk about it. You have to have an honest conversation about that. And I think with that groundswell, that's what got people to really move. Because think about this, right? We're in the middle of the worst pandemic that we've seen in my lifetime, in my 37 years, and in my parents' lifetime, right? Think about people being willing to risk contracting COVID-19 after all that we've done to flatten the curve and social distance, people being willing to take to the streets and protest because of what they saw. People were fed up. These conversations had to happen, and I am extremely sad for the Floyd family that it took his life to have these conversations. But these conversations needed to happen for a long time, and they're finally starting to happen.
Absolutely. And one of the things that I love about the repeal of 50A is that it's one of many things that we're seeing. One of the things that I talked about with my editor this week is that I know you and I are the same age. I'm 37 as well. And I can honestly say that in my lifetime, being at the Amsterdam News for the past 13 years, I've never seen such a high number of police officers that are being disciplined. I mean, we're seeing officers who are doing terrible things caught on tape, and we're seeing immediate action. And I think that, repealing 50A is definitely going to play a role in that because, the truth is we have officers who are walking around in the city, policing our streets, patrolling our streets, I should say, who have records of misconduct and even disciplines who are still on the job. Do you think that this will have any impact on that? Because I think that's a concern that a lot of people have. Obviously one of the questions that came out when George Floyd was killed is that why this officer, Derek Chauvin, had so many violations, so many misconduct, and I think he had 2 disciplines on his record. And most would say that officer should not have even been on the street patrolling, but he was. Do you think that this will be the start of even a bigger change when it comes to how police officers are disciplined, how they're hired, when they're fired?
I think that police departments will take a longer look at who's on their force because they don't want these bad apples, so to speak, up there. Again, I'll go back to the original point. Police officers do a really hard job, man. Like, their job is really tough.
I totally agree.
To ensure... Like it's a tough job. It's a job that I have a lot of respect for. So you've got to know that the person that's watching your back, because again, it's life and death possibly, right? But because of the gravity of that job, because you have the ability to possibly take lives, we have to make sure that we have the right people out there. And I think departments might take heed of, when they're reviewing these complaints and these documents that they're going to want to make sure that they get to these folks who are doing this type of conduct consistently before it gets to a point where somebody's going to be able to foil it, so that you can start to turn the department over and figure out who shouldn't be there sooner rather than later. I think that it may be something that the departments do. I don't, I can't speak for departments, all their disciplinary processes. They're usually internal. So I don't know exactly, we don't know exactly what steps they take. But I would imagine that folks are waking up and seeing a new era, and they're seeing, this is good. Because to be quite honest with you, I think we've made gains in community policing over the last couple of years. And when we saw with the social distancing enforcement, and we saw with some of the other actions during this pandemic, we were starting to lose ground. And I think that it hit a boiling point again with the murder of George Floyd. But now I think we're at a point where we can start to rebuild that trust and have these conversations between community police.
Yeah, I totally agree. I excuse me. I've said, since George Floyd was killed, I've said that I'm seeing things from the protests to the outrage. I mean, here we are in 14 days, 2 weeks of protesting. George Floyd has been laid to rest, and people are still out there pounding the pavement. in our communities, trying to make change. And I think that, doing those demonstrations is helping, because here we have legislation, a law that has been changed, that the governor is going to be signing. And so, but I did want to ask you, just on a personal level, because I think it's important that people understand how George Floyd's death is impacting people. What is your reaction to the death of George Floyd and how he died? Did you see the video? What are your thoughts about it?
It shakes me to my core as a black man. It puts you in a situation where you have an immediate reaction and you believe that could be you, right? Your title doesn't insulate you. We've seen Senator Zelma Amiri get pepper sprayed while peacefully protesting. Celebrity status doesn't insulate you. We've seen Thabo Sefolosha, NBA guard and really great defender if you're a sports fan. We've seen him, get, harmed by the NYPD. James Blake, world famous tennis player, also tackled by the NYPD, ironically, on his way to the U.S. Open. So your success level or your titles don't insulate you from your blackness, right? So that's my blackness is something I wear every day.
Mm-hmm.
I would never want to hide it. I'm proud to be black.
Mm-hmm.
But I can't. So me knowing that the reality is that could have been me or one of my friends or one of my family members,
mm-hmm.
right? It's something that kind of, it shakes you. And I think the majority of, I don't want to speak for all black men because I can never speak for that, but the black men that I've spoken to in the wake of this, I think we've had similar reactions that, like, wow, like what, that could have been me. And you think about the incidents and the conversations that you've had with police or individuals have had with police, and it's not 6 degrees separation. We're 1 degree separation of knowing somebody or personally having information and knowledge of having a not so pleasant experience with law enforcement.
Mm.
Right? So it stirs up a lot of emotion. It stirs up a lot of reflection in a way, right? Like you reflect on what your path is, and you look at your life and you wonder, like, could that have been me if I hadn't reacted in a certain way? Because that's another thing. They tell you, like, hey, do the right thing. Don't act a certain way.
Right.
And the stuff still happens to us.
Mm-hmm.
That's the frustrating part.
Yeah, I totally agree. They tell us all the time, don't resist, don't do this, don't do that. I'm a black man just like you, and I agree with everything that you just said. And even when we do the right thing, we still, get attacked, we still get abused, we still get brutalized. And so it's again, I think it's important for people to know, because a lot of people listen to this podcast. I think it's important for all people to know, what people are thinking, especially black men, as they watch these videos, watch the video of George Floyd and see his death. One thing I do want to talk to you about is the fact that there is some criticism here from several police unions. And I just want to read you a quick quote from, there was a memo that was sent, that was signed by several police unions, including the Police Benevolent Association, the Detectives Endowment Association, and the Correction Officers Benevolent Association, and several other unions. And the quote is, this is from them, it says, "The release of such records would expose the accused officer of serious safety concerns, as well as unfavorable and irreparable harm to reputation and livelihood." And this is a joint statement that was made by all those unions. What's your response to that? Because obviously there's concerns here. There's criticism that this could expose, we're talking about information that's a little sensitive, and it could cause some harm. But what do you say to that? What's your response?
I respectfully disagree. The privacy protections, things that have to do with things that are not related to their at-work employment, are shielded. Again, as I said before, the public shouldn't be able to see certain things about your personal
mm-hmm.
background, your family, your social security number, your home address. Nobody should be subjected to that. So that's something that actually came up in hearings because one of the things about the legislative process that I want to make clear and make certain, I pride myself on being someone who is deliberate. I don't like to rush through anything, no matter how passionate I may be about the subject. Mm-hmm. So I held 2 hearings over the last October, one in the city of New York and one in Albany. And I solicited testimony from people who were pro-repeal of 50A and anti-repeal of 50A. And the overarching concern that I heard in those hearings was about privacy. And it was something that I shared. It was a concern that I shared. And it was a concern that made its way into the final iteration of the bill. So I would they have the rights to their opinions. They have the right to be able to stand up for what they believe is correct. And I will also respectfully disagree and say that the privacy concerns that they seem to have outlined concerning personal matters are taken care of in this legislation.
All right. And I think it's so important for people to know that you were fair and heard both sides, because this wasn't something that was rushed. This was something that was thoroughly researched, by you and several other legislators before it even went before the legislation, before lawmakers, I should say. Excuse me. My last question for you is, obviously, let's just be very frank here, is that unfortunately, while George Floyd, what happened to him was absolutely terrible. Unfortunately, George Floyd, we've even seen over the last several weeks, terrible videos of police officers attacking people, some who have been charged, some who have been fired. It's terrible to say this, but it's the truth that George Floyd will not be the last last person this happens to, the last black person this happens to. However, with 50A being repealed, this is going to have an impact on how future cases are handled. What do you hope ahead for the future that repealing 50A will have on future cases? What are your hopes, or what's your goal for future cases?
As you said, I don't want them to happen. I want it to be able to be at a point where we can get these folks who are prone to doing this off of the force, so that we don't have these accidents, so that the 99% or whatever high 90s% it is that of good officers becomes 100%, right? And that we try to figure out how to get the bad actors out of the system. I just want to say one more thing before we wrap up. Because legislators get a lot of credit, and we get a lot of credit for passing legislation, and that's great. Mm-hmm. And I am extremely proud to have been the lead sponsor on this bill, and Danny O'Donnell and the Assembly and all my colleagues in government. But I want to talk about, just for a second, the mothers of the movement.
Sure.
The Constance Malcolm, Marley Graham's mother, Gwen Carr, Eric Garner's mother, Valerie Bell, Sean Bell's mother, so many other people, so many other mothers who really, really just made sure they were relentless in securing victories for their children. I'm a father of 2. I have 2 little girls, and I, sometimes if they scrape their elbow, I get a little nervous, right? I couldn't imagine having my children killed. It's the worst feeling in the world.
Yeah.
And not only that feeling, right, but taking that feeling and turning it into some sort of advocacy, so that you can make sure that you're looking out for the next family. And so, most importantly, that this doesn't happen again. That's really true strength, and I just want to make sure that I recognize that they are the true driving force behind this legislation. I have to make sure that I give them a great deal of credit and appreciation, and the advocates, of course, that pushed this along, that helped them out, and the protesters and things like that, and all of the people that made their voices heard, because we work for the people. We have to ultimately be responsible and responsive to the people. But the mothers of the movement, family members of the movement, I take my hat, I tip my hat to them. I bow to them. Any other, superlative that you can think about that. I just want to make sure that we properly recognize how important of a job they did in their role in it. So I just wanted to make sure I thank them, on this podcast, so that people could understand the gravity of what was done and the courage that it took those that took those mothers to step up.
Mm-hmm. Very important to mention them. Thank you so much. Well, Senator Bailey, again, your bill passed, and it's headed now to be signed by the governor, and congratulations. You're definitely making an impact on future cases, and thank you so much for being on the podcast and giving us this important information.
My pleasure, no problem, and thank you for having the Amsterdam News. It's important and critical that we're able to have news so that Black people can still have an outlet. So keep it going.
All right, thank you so much.
My pleasure. Take care.
That concludes this week's podcast. You can pick up the latest edition of the New York Amsterdam News on newsstands and get updates online at amsterdamnews.com. You can also keep up with us on Facebook at NY Amsterdam News and follow us on Twitter at NYAmNews. I'm Cyril Josh Barker. Thanks for listening.
Hi, my name is Eleanor Tatum, and I'm the publisher and editor-in-chief of the New York Amsterdam News. The coronavirus crisis has brought serious distress to local economies and advertising along with them. The New York Amsterdam News has partnered with the Local Media Association during this unprecedented crisis. Help us continue our important work in chronicling the life of Black New Yorkers, and consider making a donation to the COVID-19 Local News Fund today. Go to givebutter.com/Amsterdam News. Again, that is GIVEBUTTER.com/Amsterdam News. Thank you and stay safe.